The mid-20th century was dominated by the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This period saw many proxy battles fought around the world between the two superpowers and their respective allies. But perhaps none were as significant and controversial as the Battle of Khe Sanh in 1968, fought in the context of the Vietnam War. This engagement was a critical moment in the conflict and left an indelible mark on military history. So welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to explore what actually happened during the 77-day Battle of Khe Sanh in early 1968. Make sure to watch until the end to learn more about how the battle unfolded and why it continues to be a pivotal moment in understanding the dynamics of the Cold War. And don't forget to subscribe if you love anything to do with historical warfare. Now let's jump in. On February 1968, North Vietnamese Army regiments launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Marine Corps base at Khe Sanh in the northern part of South Vietnam. As the largest engagement of its kind in the Vietnam War, the battle would last 77 days and take the lives of 214 U.S. Marines, 13 South Vietnamese Army soldiers, and an estimated 1,500 North Vietnamese soldiers. The Battle of Khe Sanh is often remembered as the Siege of Khe Sanh, which is understandable considering that the North Vietnamese Army encircled the base on February and attempted multiple assaults on it throughout the next 3 months. But it's important to understand that this wasn't the only significant action happening. Instead, the battle was comprised of 3 distinct but related phases: the siege, the relief, and the breakout. Despite its small size and isolation, the battle had immense significance both militarily and politically. Control of the Khe Sanh region held great importance because it allowed Hanoi to threaten the entire length of Route 9, the main road leading to Laos. This control also put them in a position to cut off or monitor traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was used to move men and supplies from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. These supply routes were critical to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army efforts. By attacking and encircling Khe Sanh, the NVA hoped to deal a major blow to U.S. forces while also cutting off supply lines to other bases in the region. They believed that the mountainous terrain would help them in this endeavor, providing natural cover and concealment. But they didn't anticipate the determination of the outnumbered U.S. Marines defending the base. Khe Sanh was located in a valley surrounded by steep hills and mountains, making it difficult for reinforcements and resupply to reach the base. Despite being just 4 miles from the Cambodian border, the nearest sizable population center was over 100 miles away. This remoteness made it an ideal location for the NVA to set up an ambush and effectively cut off U.S. forces stationed there. The base itself was primarily defended by approximately 2,000 U.S. Marines belonging to the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, and 1st Battalion, 9th Marine Regiment, along with 500 South Vietnamese Army soldiers. The American forces were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John A. Leyoin, while the NVA's 18th, 21st, and 31st Regiments were led by Colonel Nguyen Van Tap. By January 1968, Khe Sanh had become a key focus of the NVA, who believed that capturing the base would significantly weaken the U.S. position in South Vietnam. As the U.S. prepared for an upcoming offensive operation called Operation Cedar Falls, which aimed to destroy Viet Cong infrastructure, the Mekong Delta, the NVA sought to divert American resources away from the Delta and toward Khe Sanh. The NVA strategy involved demonstrating their ability to inflict heavy casualties on U.S. forces and potentially even capture the base. By successfully seizing Khe Sanh, the NVA hoped to severely damage American morale and turn public opinion against the war. The battle began with an NVA artillery barrage on February, followed by a ground assault later that day. Although the NVA had superior numbers, the U.S. Marines were well positioned in defensive bunkers and utilized effective fire support, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. Despite the initial setback, the NVA refused to abandon the attack and launched wave after wave of assaults on the base, each one being repelled by the determined defenders. The NVA continued to bombard the base with artillery fire, attempting to weaken the defenders and force them to abandon the post. Additionally, the NVA sought to prevent any relief attempts by attacking convoys traveling to Khe Sanh. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force conducted airstrikes and provided close air support to the beleaguered base. However, bad weather often hindered these efforts. As the situation at Khe Sanh grew increasingly dire, the U.S. sent in additional forces to relieve the besieged Marines. The first relief column reached the base on March 8, 1968, marking the beginning of the second phase of the battle. With reinforcements and resupplies arriving, the Marines were able to mount counterattacks, pushing the NVN back from the base perimeter. Despite their numerical advantage, the NVN struggled to dislodge the entrenched U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. Once relief forces secured the base, attention shifted to establishing a secure corridor to allow for the constant flow of supplies and reinforcements. Despite fierce fighting, the relief forces were successful in expanding the corridor, enabling them to deliver much-needed supplies to the Marines at Khe Sanh. The third and final phase of the battle commenced on March 29 when elements of the 3rd Marine Division, including the 7th Marines, attacked towards Khe Sanh to break out of the siege. As part of Operation Buffalo, the 7th Marines advanced through dense jungle terrain, encountering heavy enemy fire. On April 1st, after securing Hill 881, the 7th Marines linked up with the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines near Khe Sanh. Having established contact, the two battalions worked together to broaden the corridor leading to the base. By May, the 7th Marines had expanded the corridor to approximately 2,000 yards, facilitating the arrival of additional troops and supplies. The relief forces also constructed a series of fortified positions along the corridor, ensuring the safety of convoys traveling to and from Khe Sanh. While the battle officially ended on April 11th, the 7th Marines remained in place until late July, continuing to secure the area around Khe Sanh. On July 28th, the 7th Marines handed over their positions to the 3rd Brigade, 21st Infantry Division, marking the end of Operation Buffalo and the official withdrawal of the 7th Marines from the Khe Sanh region. In terms of casualties, 214 U.S. Marines, 13 ARVN and 1,500 North Vietnamese soldiers lost their lives. In addition to the human cost, the battle had significant implications for both sides. From a military standpoint, the Siege of Khe Sanh demonstrated the effectiveness of the NVA's guerrilla tactics and their ability to endure against conventional forces. Despite suffering heavy losses, the NVA had inflicted a considerable toll on U.S. forces and emerged as a formidable opponent. The battle also highlighted the challenges faced by the U.S. in the Vietnam War, emphasizing the difficulties of fighting a non-traditional war against a determined and elusive enemy. Politically, the Siege of Khe Sanh had profound implications for the Vietnam War. The intense media coverage of the battle fueled anti-war sentiment in the United States, as graphic images of the fighting and casualties were widely circulated. The perception of the U.S. struggle at Khe Sanh contributed to growing skepticism about the war and raised questions about America's ability to succeed in Vietnam. The aftermath of the battle led to a re-evaluation of U.S. strategy in Vietnam, as well as increased calls for peace negotiations and a withdrawal of American troops. Today, the Battle of Khe Sanh remains an important case study in military history, offering lessons in unconventional warfare and the complexities of modern combat. It serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by conventional forces when engaging in protracted conflicts against guerrilla armies in unfamiliar terrain. The battle also continues to be a source of debate and discussion regarding the Vietnam War and the broader Cold War era. Historians and military analysts continue to examine the events at Khe Sanh, analyzing the strategies, tactics, and decision-making of both sides. Furthermore, the Siege of Khe Sanh has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and articles, ensuring that the stories of the brave soldiers who fought there continue to be told and remembered. In conclusion, the Battle of Khe Sanh stands as a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, marking a turning point in the conflict and leaving a lasting impact on military history. The battle between the US and North Vietnamese forces highlighted the challenges and complexities of fighting a non-traditional war against a determined and elusive enemy. The siege and subsequent relief of Khe Sanh tested the endurance and resilience of both sides, showcasing the human cost and immense sacrifices involved in modern warfare. The outcome of the battle had significant implications for the Vietnam War, contributing to growing skepticism about the conflict in the United States and leading to calls for peace negotiations and the withdrawal of American troops. Today, the Battle of Khe Sanh continues to be a subject of interest and study for historians and military enthusiasts alike, serving as a reminder of the challenges and complexities of modern warfare. We hope you enjoyed learning more about the Battle of Khe Sanh. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button below and leave us a comment. We love hearing what you have to say, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on any of our exciting content. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. The Battle of Khe Sanh. How did it change the Vietnam War? The year is 1968. You're watching the news. You hear about the fall of Hue, the Tet Offensive, and the withdrawal of US Marines from the city. But there's still hope. There's still a base in the hills called Khe Sanh, still occupied by American paratroopers. They are confident that they can hold out until relief comes. After all, General Westmoreland has told them that Khe Sanh is an important military stronghold and they are well equipped to defend it. But what they don't know is that they're being watched. And if you were watching back then, you knew it too. The enemy is closing in on Khe Sanh, and soon they will launch a surprise attack that threatens to destroy the entire base. Can the Americans fight back, or will they be defeated? That's what we'll find out today. But before we get started, please do and forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss any of our videos. And if you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a member. Now let's go back to Khe Sanh. On January 21, 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of surprise attacks across South Vietnam. One of the targets was the Marine base at Hue, but after fierce fighting, the Marines managed to repel the attack and retake the city. However, this victory came at a cost. The Marines had suffered heavy casualties and their morale was low. They needed a break. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, was regrouping. They had realized that they could not defeat the Marines head-on, so they decided to try something else. They would lay a siege to a small outpost in the hills called Khe Sanh. The outpost was located near the border with Laos. It was manned by a company of paratroopers from the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, part of the American Division. The outpost was not very important militarily, but it was strategically located. It could be used as a base for operations in the surrounding area. The Americans did not know this, though. They thought that the outpost was just another small outpost. The NVA launched their attack on February 1968. They surrounded the outpost and opened fire from all sides. The Americans were caught off guard. They had not expected such a strong attack. They fought back bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within hours, the NVA had destroyed most of the buildings on the base and killed or wounded most of the American defenders. The Americans were forced to retreat into the hills. There they fought as guerrillas, harassing the NVA and trying to make contact with friendly forces. But the NVA were determined to capture the base. They brought in reinforcements and supplies and they launched a relentless assault. Day after day, week after week, the Americans held on. They repelled attack after attack, but they were slowly being worn down. Their ammunition was running low and their morale was at rock bottom. They needed help, but the help was not coming. The American command was aware of the situation at Khe Sanh, but they did not consider it to be a priority. They were focused on the Tet Offensive in Hue and other parts of South Vietnam. They thought that the paratroopers at Khe Sanh could hold out for a few more weeks until they could send reinforcements. But the paratroopers could not hold out. On April 8, 1968, they were forced to abandon the base and flee into the jungle. They were rescued by a helicopter, but not before suffering heavy casualties. The NVA had won a major victory. They had captured an important outpost and inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Americans. The Americans were shocked by the loss of Khe Sanh. They could not believe that they had been beaten by a force that was smaller and weaker than theirs. They launched an investigation to find out how it had happened. They wanted to know who was responsible for the disaster. They also wanted to know how they could prevent it from happening again. The investigation revealed that there had been a series of blunders that had led to the loss of Khe Sanh. The American command had underestimated the enemy. They had not taken the threat at Khe Sanh seriously. They had also failed to coordinate with other units. And they had not provided the paratroopers with enough supplies and reinforcements. Most importantly, the investigation revealed that the American strategy in Vietnam was wrong. The Americans were trying to fight a war of attrition against the NVA, but they were doing it in the wrong way. They were trying to destroy the NVA in big battles, but the NVA was a guerrilla army. They were elusive and they melted away whenever the Americans tried to engage them. The Americans were losing badly. After the fall of Khe Sanh, the American public was outraged. They demanded revenge. They wanted the Americans to destroy the NVA and win the war. But the American leaders knew that this was impossible. The war had become a stalemate. The Americans could not win on the battlefield. So they tried to win off the battlefield. They began to bomb North Vietnam heavily. They also began to negotiate with the NVA. These efforts failed. The NVA was not willing to negotiate. And the bombing of North Vietnam only made the NVA more determined. In 1969, the American president, Richard Nixon, visited China. He met with the Chinese leaders and told them that he wanted to end the war in Vietnam. The Chinese leaders agreed to help him. They put pressure on the North Vietnamese government to end the war. The North Vietnamese were reluctant, but they had no choice. They had been fighting for 20 years, they were exhausted, and they needed peace. On January 27, 1973, the Americans and the NVA signed the Paris Peace Accords. The Americans withdrew from Vietnam and the NVA won. The Battle of Khe Sanh had been a turning point in the war. It had shown the Americans that they could not win on the battlefield. It had also shown the world that the Americans were willing to end the war. Without victory, the Siege of Khe Sanh proved to be a major challenge for the U.S. military. While it didn't result in a decisive victory for either side, it played a significant role in shaping the Vietnam War's outcome. Here's why. First, the battle highlighted the limitations of conventional military tactics. The U.S. military's strength lay in its air power and advanced weaponry. However, these assets were less effective against a decentralized, elusive enemy like the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, who relied on guerrilla tactics. This became evident at Khe Sanh, where the U.S. was unable to dislodge the entrenched enemy using overwhelming force. Second, the siege had a profound impact on domestic American morale. The U.S. media provided extensive coverage of the battle, emphasizing the heavy casualties and attritional losses. As the siege dragged on, public support for the war waned. The battle contributed to growing doubts about the U.S. military's ability to achieve a clear victory in Vietnam. Third, the battle exposed the challenges of sustaining a prolonged war in a hostile environment. Unlike World War II, where supply lines were relatively secure, in Vietnam, the U.S. faced constant threats to its logistical infrastructure. This was exemplified by the difficulties in supplying and evacuating Khe Sanh, which underscored the broader issue of sustaining military operations in a remote and isolated theater of war. Fourth, the battle contributed to the perception of the war as unwinnable. By early 1968, despite heavy investment and hundreds of thousands of troops deployed, the U.S. had yet to achieve a decisive victory. The failure to secure Khe Sanh reinforced this sense of stalemate and futility, leading many Americans to question the war's purpose and whether it could ever be won. Fifth, the battle had significant political implications. The anti-war movement gained momentum as casualties mounted and the war's objectives remained unclear. President Lyndon B. Johnson's decision to run for re-election in 1968 was seen as partly influenced by the perceived need to demonstrate progress in Vietnam. However, the outcome of the Battle of Khe Sanh and the continued stalemate in the war contributed to his decision to not seek re-election. Sixth, the battle had a lasting impact on U.S. military strategy. The difficulty in securing Khe Sanh and the heavy casualties inflicted led to reevaluations of military tactics and strategies. The U.S. began to focus more on counterinsurgency operations and winning the support of the local population rather than solely relying on overwhelming military force. Finally, the battle remains a subject of historical debate and analysis. Historians continue to examine the Battle of Khe Sanh to understand its causes, consequences, and the factors that contributed to the Vietnam War's overall outcome. The battle serves as a case study for military strategy, the relationship between domestic public opinion and foreign policy, and the complexities of modern warfare. In conclusion, the Battle of Khe Sanh stands out as a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, highlighting the challenges of conventional warfare, a protracted guerrilla conflict. Its impact on domestic American morale, the war's political landscape, and U.S. military strategy had lasting consequences for the war's outcome and for American perspectives on global conflicts in the late 20th century. Now it's time to ask you a question. What do you think? Why did the Battle of Khe Sanh change the Vietnam War? In the annals of the Vietnam War's military history, the Siege of Khe Sanh stands out as one of the most controversial and studied battles where the armored units of the North Vietnamese Army, or PAVN, played a pivotal role in encircling American forces and delivering strategic blows that shook the foundations of the U.S. military presence in the region. Khe Sanh, that remote military base in northern South Vietnam, became the stage for a bloody conflict that lasted months, during which the Vietnamese use of tanks and armored vehicles emerged as a decisive factor in the battle's outcome despite the geographical and logistical challenges faced by their forces. Welcome to the channel, and today let us talk about the Vietnamese armored units during the Siege of Khe Sanh and find out why they were so important to the battle. So the year is 1968 and we are in Khe Sanh, a small village in the north of South Vietnam. The US has established a military base there and the NVA wants to take it out. Now the NVA knows that Khe Sanh is located in a valley surrounded by high mountains, making it hard for armored vehicles to maneuver. But they also know that the terrain is not impassable and that with careful planning, they can use their armored units to great effect. The main road leading to the base is narrow and winding, making it almost impossible for tanks to move through except during daytime. This means that if the NVA wants to attack, they have to do so at night when the Americans are most vulnerable. And so it begins. First came the infantry. They moved into columns, one from the northwest and the other from the southeast. Their task was simple: to block all the escape routes from the base. Once they had secured their positions, the NVA called in their armored units. There were only a few tanks and armored vehicles, but they were enough to make the Americans think twice about leaving the base. At this point, you might be wondering why the NVA even bothered with tanks at all. After all, they were outnumbered and outgunned by the Americans, so why risk losing them? Well, the thing is, the NVA didn't really expect to win a tank battle against the Americans. Instead, they used their tanks and armored vehicles as a psychological weapon. The mere presence of tanks instilled fear among the defenders, making them more likely to stay put and fight to the death rather than risk being captured. Additionally, the NVA knew that the Americans would be reluctant to let their air power operate at night, giving the tanks a free hand to maneuver and attack. And so the siege began. The Americans inside the base were trapped. They could not escape without risking being captured or killed. They tried to hold out, but they were running low on supplies and ammunition. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the NVA launched a surprise attack. A column of tanks and armored vehicles rumbled towards the base, firing their guns and spraying the defenders with machine gun fire. It was a terrifying sight for the Americans, who had never seen anything like it before. They fought back bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one, their weapons fell silent. Just when it seemed like the end was near, help arrived. American air power struck the tanks and armored vehicles, sending them reeling. The NVA assault had been repelled, but the Americans were shaken. They had never faced such a determined attack before. The battle raged on for weeks, but the NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles marked a turning point in the war. The Americans had underestimated the threat posed by these vehicles and had not prepared accordingly. As a result, they suffered heavy losses. After the siege, the Americans would learn from their mistakes. They began developing new tactics and strategies to counter the threat posed by tanks and armored vehicles. But the damage had already been done. The NVA had proven that they were capable of using tanks and armored vehicles effectively, and this would haunt the Americans for the rest of the war. In fact, the use of tanks and armored vehicles by the NVA would become a common theme throughout the war. But to understand why, we need to go back to the beginning. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles can be traced back to the early days of the war. When the war began, the NVA was a ragtag army. They were poorly trained and equipped, and they were vastly outnumbered by the Americans. But they were fighting on their home turf, and they knew the terrain like the back of their hands. They also had the support of the local population, who saw the war as a fight for independence. The NVA's early victories gave them confidence, and they began to believe that they could win the war. But they needed to be able to project force beyond their borders. This was necessary because the war was not just being fought in the jungles and mountains of Vietnam, it was also being fought in the minds of the American people. The NVA needed to show the world that they were capable of winning, and they needed to do it in a way that would capture the imagination of the public. Enter tanks and armored vehicles. The NVA began acquiring tanks and armored vehicles from their allies, the Soviet Union and China. The vehicles were not always what the NVA wanted, but they made do with what they had. For example, the NVA received a large number of Soviet T-5 tanks. These were old and outdated, but they were still formidable. The NVA also received a number of Chinese Type 60 tanks. These were similar to the Soviet T-54s, but they were a bit newer and more advanced. In addition to tanks, the NVA also received a number of armored personnel carriers, anti-aircraft vehicles, and other types of armored vehicles. These vehicles were not just for show, they were an integral part of the NVA's military strategy. For example, the NVA used armored personnel carriers to transport troops to the battlefield. They also used them to provide fire support and to protect key installations. The NVA also used anti-aircraft vehicles to defend against American air power, which, as we have seen, was a very important part of the American military arsenal. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles was not always successful. In fact, many of the vehicles were lost due to mechanical problems or friendly fire. But the NVA did not care. They were willing to take the risk because the benefits outweighed the costs. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles was a bold gamble. It was a risky strategy that could have backfired badly, but it paid off. The NVA won the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, and they gained international support. As the war dragged on, the NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles became more sophisticated. They began using them in larger numbers and in more complex operations. For example, the NVA began using tanks and armored vehicles to break through enemy lines and to conduct hit-and-run attacks. They also began using them to lay mines and to set up ambushes. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles reached its peak during the Eastern Offensive of 1972. The NVA launched a massive offensive across the country using tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. The offensive caught the Americans off guard and they were forced to retreat. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles was a major factor in the success of the offensive. As the war came to an end, the NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles continued to evolve. They began using them in more urban areas and they began using them to protect convoys and to defend key infrastructure. The NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles was a major factor in their victory in the war. They were able to use these vehicles to project power, to break through enemy lines, and to defend key installations. To sum it all up, the NVA's use of tanks and armored vehicles was a bold and risky strategy that paid off in the end. They were able to use these vehicles to project power, to break through enemy lines, and to defend key installations. Although the Siege of Khe Sanh would be one of the last major engagements of the war, the lessons learned there would serve both sides well in future conflicts. The American military would come to understand the value of armored vehicles in jungle warfare, and the North Vietnamese Army would demonstrate the effectiveness of combining tanks with infantry in new and creative ways. So what do you think? Did you enjoy the video? If so, please remember to subscribe and leave your comments below. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us make better videos for you. Thank you for watching. Until next time. The Battle of Khe Sanh was the most significant engagement between U.S. Marines and North Vietnamese Army regulars during the Vietnam War. What makes it so interesting is the fact that it represents so much more than a battle. This was a test of wills between the United States and Soviet Union, two superpowers who were engaged in a global struggle known as the Cold War. Each side believed that by winning at Khe Sanh, they could demonstrate the superiority of their way of life and deal a devastating blow to their enemy. Today, we're going to take a look at what happened there, why it matters, and why it's still relevant today. Welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host. So what exactly was the Battle of Khe Sanh? It was a 3-month-long siege that took place between January and March 1968. The siege occurred at a small outpost that the United States Marines called Khe Sanh. At the time, Khe Sanh was located deep within enemy territory and had been established as an advanced field firepower base in September 1965. Its primary purpose was to monitor and harass North Vietnamese Army traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths and roads that ran through southern Laos and southern Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was vital to the Communist war effort because it allowed supplies, reinforcements, and equipment to be moved from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. But it wasn't easy to monitor or harass because it was heavily forested, spanned large areas, and contained many supply depots hidden deep in the jungle. That's where Khe Sanh came in. Khe Sanh was built in a valley surrounded by hills on 3 sides and open to the east, which made it an ideal location for spotting enemy movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. From here, U.S. Marines could observe everything happening on the trail and respond accordingly. For example, they could use their loudspeakers to warn away North Vietnamese Army soldiers or issue them surrender warnings before opening fire. If necessary, however, the Marines soon realized that the North Vietnamese Army knew about their presence and would often avoid detection by traveling only at night or using alternate routes. This meant that Khe Sanh wasn't just a monitoring post. It had to be defended as well, which wasn't easy because of its remote location. In fact, Khe Sanh was so far from other U.S. bases that Marines stationed there jokingly referred to it as the Forgotten Outposts. Part of the reason for this was that Khe Sanh was difficult to reach by road. The closest major highway was more than 30 miles away, which meant that resupplies had to be delivered by helicopter. Another part of the reason was that Khe Sanh was considered a high-priority target by the U.S. military. In other words, few resources were devoted to defending it. All of this changed in January 1968, however, when reports indicated that large numbers of North Vietnamese Army soldiers were massing in the area. Suddenly, Khe Sanh became a very important defensive position. And so thousands of Marines were sent there to reinforce its defenses. On January, the North Vietnamese Army launched a surprise attack on Khe Sanh. The assault came from three directions: south from hill fights, west from Route 9, and north from the Laos border. The attackers numbered between 10,000 and 20,000 men. According to U.S. estimates, they were organized into 5 regiments of the North Vietnamese Army: the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 17th. These units were supported by heavy artillery, recoilless rifles, and anti-aircraft missiles. The Americans had only 2,000 combat-ready troops to defend Khe Sanh, plus an additional 1,200 wounded Marines recovering at the base hospital. Despite being outnumbered almost 10 to 1, the defenders held their ground. For the next 3 months, the North Vietnamese Army attempted to dislodge them without success. What followed was one of the most intense periods of fighting during the entire Vietnam War. Day and night, the Americans could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire as the North Vietnamese Army bombarded them from all sides. At times, bombs fell so close together that it sounded like one giant explosion. In response, U.S. aircraft flew over Khe Sanh every hour, dropping napalm and releasing rockets into the surrounding jungle. This caused hundreds of fires to break out, which made it difficult for anyone to move around safely. Furthermore, malaria and other tropical diseases spread quickly among the Marines because they lacked adequate supplies of insect repellent. Food also became scarce as supply runs were often canceled due to bad weather or enemy attacks. Soon, hunger and fatigue began to take their toll on morale. Still, the Marines held firm until relief finally arrived in mid-March. So why was the Battle of Khe Sanh important? There are 2 main reasons. First, it showed the world how strong the North Vietnamese Army really was. Before Khe Sanh, most people in the United States had no idea that there were so many communists fighting in Vietnam. Second, the battle demonstrated the incredible tenacity and fighting spirit of the Marines. Even though they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, they refused to give up. In fact, they fought back against the North Vietnamese Army and inflicted heavy casualties on them. This proved that America's enemies didn't have an easy victory against the United States military. And that was important during the Cold War because it demonstrated American resolve. The United States entered the Vietnam War as a way to contain the spread of communism. If the communists were able to take over South Vietnam, then it would appear as if the United States had lost the battle against communism in Southeast Asia, and this would be a huge propaganda victory for the Soviet Union and China, who were America's main rivals during the Cold War. As we mentioned earlier, both the Soviets and the Chinese provided the North Vietnamese with weapons, ammunition, food, and other supplies to help them fight against the Americans. Therefore, if the North Vietnamese were able to defeat the Americans at Khe Sanh, it would mean that the Soviet and Chinese had also defeated the United States. This would be a major embarrassment for the United States and would make it harder for them to maintain their position as the world as superpower. Today, the Battle of Khe Sanh is still remembered as one of the most intense and brutal battles of the Vietnam War. It was a clash between 2 superpowers, each determined to win not just the battle, but the war. In the end, the North Vietnamese Army was unable to capture Khe Sanh. Instead, they had to retreat after suffering heavy losses. The Americans, meanwhile, suffered heavy losses as well, but they were able to hold onto the base. That said, Khe Sanh is now a ghost town. The U.S. abandoned the base in early 1968 and it was never rebuilt. Today, visitors can explore the ruins of Khe Sanh Combat Base, which are located near the demilitarized zone that separates North Vietnam from South Vietnam. The ruins include the remains of bunkers, buildings, and other structures that were once used by the U.S. military. In addition, there is a memorial at Khe Sanh that commemorates the Marines who died there. Every year on January, hundreds of people visit Khe Sanh to pay their respects to those who died in the battle. Today, the Battle of Khe Sanh continues to be analyzed by military historians. Some argue that it was a tactical victory for the North Vietnamese Army because they were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Americans. Others argue that it was a strategic victory for the United States because they were able to hold on to Khe Sanh and prevent it from falling into enemy hands. There is no doubt that the Battle of Khe Sanh was one of the most significant events of the Vietnam War. It was a test of wills between two superpowers, and the outcome could have had a major impact on the course of the war. At the end of the day, what do you think? Do you agree with one assessment over the other? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. As always, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments section. On January 31st, 1968, U.S. Marines repelled an attack by 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, bringing them one step closer to relieving the Siege of Khe Sanh. Over the course of the next 2 months, the Marine Corps committed over 24,000 troops to this effort. They were joined by soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also known as the ARVN, or South Vietnamese Army, but even though relief was on the way, this base in the remote hills of central Vietnam had already proven itself to be one of the most controversial points of the entire war. Despite its location at the edge of the jungle, far from the main communist supply bases and deep inside one of the most inhospitable regions of Vietnam, U.S. military leaders insisted on defending it with all necessary force. In fact, the entire episode began when Colonel Lewis Walt, commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division, ordered his men to hold fast to the base despite intelligence suggesting that it was about to be attacked. Walt's orders came on January, just 4 days before the first major assault, and they caught many officers by surprise. According to Lieutenant Colonel John D. Lavelle, who commanded the Marine artillery unit supporting the ground troops, no one was quite sure why they were ordered to stay. I asked several senior officers why we weren't pulling out, he recalled, and they said because Westmoreland said don't give up Khe Sanh. But what exactly were the reasons for this decision? And how did it come about? From Washington to Saigon to the remote jungles of Vietnam, those in charge justified the defense of Khe Sanh in much different ways. The main argument centered around the idea that the base was too important to give up. It was a key part of the U.S. strategy for ending the war. This explanation was put forth by General William C. Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, better known as MACV. He described Khe Sanh as a critical point in the defense of South Vietnam, explaining that it was located in a region that communist leaders in Hanoi had attempted to penetrate for years. Westmoreland told reporters that the enemy wanted to take Khe Sanh so badly because it was an ideal base for launching attacks against the neighboring provinces of Con Tum, Pleiku, and Nha Trang. These areas were all critical to the South Vietnamese government's control of the Central Highlands. And if they fell into communist hands, the guerrillas in southern Vietnam would soon enjoy a steady supply of men and weapons. By denying the communists control of Khe Sanh, Westmoreland argued the United States was preventing them from using the surrounding mountains as a staging ground for further operations. At the same time, the base served as an advanced observation point for American forces, enabling them to monitor enemy movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the famous network of jungle tracks used by Hanoi to ship men and supplies into southern Vietnam passed just 20 miles north of Khe Sanh. If U.S. forces stationed there were able to spot incoming enemy reinforcement or supply convoys, they could then alert South Vietnamese troops positioned in the area, disrupting the communist supply lines and weakening their ability to wage war. In addition to its value as a logistical hub, Khe Sanh was also one of America's longest-lasting and most heavily fortified bases in Vietnam. Unlike many other sites where troops were rotated in and out regularly, thousands of Marines had made Khe Sanh their home for nearly 3 years. As such, they had good reason to believe that their efforts there were bearing fruit. Base Defense Officer Major Charles R. Smith explained that since the U.S. had spent so much blood, treasure, and time building up the site, it would be a shame to let it go to waste. "We can't pull out," he declared, "not after all the work we've done." That sentiment was echoed by many of his fellow Marines, who felt that giving up Khe Sanh would be a sign of weakness. Sergeant Michael Strank, for instance, told Newsweek magazine that if they forced us out of Khe Sanh, our prestige is shot. Nobody will think we're invincible anymore. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson implied that evacuating the base would damage America's reputation overseas. While speaking to South Korean President Park Geun, in November 1965, Johnson claimed that the communists could end Tet Khe Sanh because he personally saw to it that every day two Air Force cargo planes landed there filled with supplies. As he explained to Park, if the enemy captured Khe Sanh, word would spread around the world that the US had abandoned another ally just like we did in Korea. Of course, the president wasn't being completely honest here. Not only had the US not abandoned South Korea, but the very reason American troops were present in Vietnam in the first place was to prevent another Korea from happening. Nonetheless, Johnson was right about one thing. If Khe Sanh fell, it would do great damage to American morale. For nearly 2 years, the base had been mentioned in newspapers and evening news broadcasts across the country. During the Christmas season of 1965, for example, few things captured the public's imagination more than the story of two Marines stationed there who organized a secret Santa gift exchange. And who could forget the Christmas bombing raids of 1965, when U.S. aircraft flew over the base carrying thousands of pounds of toys, food and ammunition for lonely Marines unable to spend the holiday with their families. As journalist Peter Bradley pointed out in the Washington Post, if Khe Sanh fell, those Marines would likely die, meaning that thousands of Americans would learn the true cost of the war. So from a purely political perspective, it made sense for Westmoreland and his superiors to insist on holding the base. Evacuating Khe Sanh would have been a major embarrassment for the United States and could have undermined support for the war back home. That was especially true considering the previous year's events at another beleaguered U.S. base named FSB-42, or simply Firebase 42. Located in the Mekong Delta, FSB-42 had been attacked repeatedly by Viet Cong guerrillas. By early 1966, the outpost's commander, Captain Harold G. Moore, was so desperate for assistance that he radioed his superiors and asked them to either send him reinforcement or prepare to evacuate the base. When help didn't arrive as expected, Moore ordered his men to destroy their equipment and defenses and flee into the night. In the ensuing chaos, however, 6 Americans were killed, 42 wounded, and 176 went missing. Many of them, including Moore, were captured and spent years in communist prison camps. As Captain Larry D. Taylor, who led one of the search and rescue helicopters involved in the evacuation attempt, later explained the debacle, FSB-42 had proven that the U.S. couldn't rely on the Vietnamese to save them from embarrassing situations. Once word got out that so many Americans had been taken prisoner, panic set in among military leaders and politicians alike. They knew that if something similar happened at Khe Sanh, the consequences would be devastating. Finally, there was the small matter of Westmoreland's ego. As one of the most experienced soldiers in the U.S. Army, having served in both World War II and Korea, the general wasn't going to stand by and watch one of his bases get overrun without a fight. In fact, he believed that the Siege of Khe Sanh presented him with a golden opportunity to prove himself once and for all. As historian Bruce Petty wrote in his book The Battle of Khe Sanh, Westmoreland saw the siege as his chance to demonstrate that conventional warfare still had its place in the modern world and that the U.S. Army was capable of defeating any enemy on the field. To this end, he ordered his men to defend Khe Sanh as if their lives depended on it, which in many cases they did. But while these justifications may have made sense to Westmoreland and his superiors, they didn't hold up too much scrutiny. As the siege dragged on and the death toll mounted, more and more officers began questioning whether Khe Sanh was truly worth the price. One of the first to speak out was Colonel Samuel Coster, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines during the siege. On February 11th, he wrote a classified letter to the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at Marine Headquarters in Okinawa, expressing his belief that the base should be abandoned. My opinion, he stated plainly, is that Khe Sanh Combat Base is not worth the tremendous loss of life and material to hold it. Nearly 2 weeks later, That assessment was echoed by Major General Victor H. Krulak, commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division. On February 24th, he informed his superiors that the battle for Khe Sanh was neither operationally nor strategically valuable. There are only 2 courses of action available to us, he stated, withdraw or die. In the end, however, his recommendation was overruled by Westmoreland, who insisted that the base be defended to the bitter end. For the Marine station there, that meant fighting tooth and nail against thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers determined to take the base at any cost. What followed has become known as the Battle of Khe Sanh, and it was one of the bloodiest and most controversial episodes of the entire Vietnam War. This has been the history of Khe Sanh. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below to let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.